If you had asked me a year ago how I pictured my wedding day, I could have described it down to the smallest detail. The flowers, fresh and white, lined along the aisle like a promise. The air buzzing with soft laughter and the rustle of silk. The string quartet in the corner, bowing through a song my bride and I had chosen months before. And in the front row, just to my left, my mother, smiling, proud, maybe even tearing up as she watched her only son step into his future. But reality has a way of tearing holes in the perfect picture you've painted. When I looked to that seat on my wedding day, it was empty. Not just empty, untouched. The cushion smooth, uncreased, the white ribbon tied to the back swaying slightly in the faint breeze from the open doors. It was the kind of absence you could feel, like a missing tooth your tongue can't help but find. And I knew it wasn't a mistake, because 10 minutes earlier I had heard her voice, sharp, cold, and deliberate, just outside the entrance. "He doesn't come in here. Not today. Not ever." I had been standing just behind the carved wooden doors, half hidden in the shadows, adjusting my cufflinks, when the words cut through the chatter like a blade. The venue's security guard shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, but nodded in the way people do when they're speaking to someone used to getting exactly what they want. She hadn't seen me. She hadn't lowered her voice. She wanted those words to be heard. My first instinct was that I'd misheard her, that she was talking about someone else, a guest, maybe, or a distant relative she'd been fighting with. But then she said my name, quietly, but with that unmistakable edge that told me she meant every syllable. The security guard's eyes found mine over her shoulder. There was pity there, and something else. A silent question. "Do you want me to follow her orders?" I stepped forward without answering, the click of my shoes on the marble sounding louder than the music inside. I didn't look at her. I didn't say a word. I simply walked past them both, my pulse hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I might collapse before I reached the aisle. I told myself it didn't matter, that she'd change her mind once she saw me standing there, that whatever this was, it could wait until after the vows, after the photos, after the toasts. But now, with guests filling the seats, and my bride minutes away from walking toward me, her chair remained empty. And I couldn't ignore it. It's strange how a single empty chair can feel bigger than the room itself. All around me, people shifted, murmured, smiled politely, but I could feel their eyes flicking toward that space, wondering if it was a last-minute absence or something more. I knew what they were thinking, because I was thinking it too. What could possibly make a mother refuse to sit beside her son on his wedding day? I tried to focus on the aisle, on the pale runner leading to the altar, on the soft swell of music as the quartet shifted into the processional. But my mind kept dragging me back to the sound of her voice at the door, the cold finality of it, the way it made the air feel heavier. I thought about the last time she'd looked at me with anything close to pride. I couldn't remember when that had been. We'd had our arguments, sure. She'd always had a way of making me feel like I was walking a tightrope, every step a test I could fail at any second. But this was a public declaration, a choice to humiliate me in front of everyone I knew. And the worst part? I didn't know why. The officiant cleared his throat, a subtle reminder that the ceremony was about to begin. Somewhere in the distance, a door opened. There was a hush. Then the guests rose to their feet in unison, the rustle of fabric and shuffle of shoes echoing in the vaulted ceiling above us. At the far end of the aisle, a wave of white and lace appeared. My bride, radiant, her arm looped through her father's. Her eyes found mine immediately, her smile steady and bright, though I thought I caught the faintest flicker of confusion as she glanced toward the empty seat at my side. I forced a smile back, tightening my grip on the edge of the lectern to keep from glancing at that chair again. This was supposed to be our moment, hers and mine. But the absence beside me sat like a shadow over everything. And in the back of my mind, her words replayed. Not today. Not ever. I didn't know it then, but the reason behind those words, the truth she had been hiding for years, would explode before the day was over. It wouldn't just change my wedding. It would burn the life I thought I knew down to its foundations, and leave me standing in the ashes with a choice I never wanted to make. People will tell you that no one knows you like your mother. They say it like it's a comfort, like having someone who can read you with a glance, is always a good thing. What they don't tell you is that when that same person decides you're a disappointment, there's no hiding from it. They'll see it in you, even when it isn't there. For as long as I can remember, my mother carried herself like the world was watching her. Even in our kitchen, with no one else around, she stood like she was posing for a photograph. Every word she spoke was measured, weighed for its effect. She liked control, she liked results, she liked winning, and she liked reminding me, without ever saying it outright, that I didn't measure up. My earliest memories of her approval were tied to achievements she could show off. An award at school? She'd smile for the photo, hand on my shoulder, telling everyone how proud she was. A week later, if I brought home a grade that wasn't perfect, she'd sigh, not angrily, just enough to let me know I'd slipped. With her, affection was a currency, and I never seemed to have enough to buy much of it. My father, well, he was different. He was quieter, softer around the edges. He worked long hours and didn't like confrontation. He'd watch my mother's criticisms land like small, sharp stones and say nothing. I used to think he didn't notice. Later, I realized he just didn't want the fight. It wasn't always cruel. She could be warm, generous even, when things went her way. There were days when she'd laugh with me in the kitchen, teaching me how to make her lemon shortbread cookies, flour dusting the counter between us. But those moments were rare, and they felt conditional, like I was borrowing her kindness and the due date was always close. As I got older, I learned to read the signs. The tightness around her eyes when she thought I'd embarrassed her. The way her voice dropped when she was angry, never loud, always cutting. The way she could turn a compliment into a warning. I'm proud of you for getting that job, now don't mess it up. By the time I was finishing high school, I'd started to see just how much of my life she expected to direct. College, career, even the kind of friends I kept. She had a vision for all of it, and it didn't include me making my own decisions. When I told her I wanted to study architecture, she didn't argue. She smiled in that polite public way and said, "That's interesting." But later that night, she left a brochure for our family's accounting firm on my desk with a note, "This is the smart choice." I ignored it. And that was when the first crack between us deepened into something more like a fault line. It wasn't one big explosion. It was smaller than that. Little acts of quiet sabotage. She'd forget to pass along messages from the university, or she'd tell relatives I was still deciding on my future, like my choice didn't exist until she approved of it. At family dinners, she'd steer the conversation toward my older cousin, who was already working in finance, and say things like, "Now there's someone with direction." I tried not to let it get to me, but when the person you've been taught to seek approval from withholds it, it eats at you. You start wondering if maybe they're right about you. Years later, when I met Claire, the woman who would become my wife, I thought maybe my mother would see me differently. Claire was everything my mother claimed to value. Polished, ambitious, the daughter of a well-connected family. She had a way of lighting up a room without trying, and I knew my mother noticed. At first it worked. My mother welcomed her with open arms, showering her with compliments. She told me, "Don't lose this one. She'll keep you on track." I tried to take it as encouragement, but the words carried that familiar edge, as if Claire was valuable because she could fix whatever my mother thought was wrong with me. Planning the wedding was when the cracks widened again. It started with small disagreements. The guest list, the venue, the colors. She'd frame her opinions as suggestions, but I knew better. If I didn't take them, she'd sigh or smile tightly, then find some way to make her disapproval felt. One evening, I overheard her on the phone with one of her friends. "I just have to make sure it's not embarrassing." I didn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I didn't need to. I knew she was talking about me. I told myself it didn't matter, that she was just being herself, that I could handle it. But in the weeks before the wedding, her attitude shifted into something colder. She started speaking about the day like it was hers to control. I'd mention a detail I was excited about, the music, the food, and she'd brush it off. "We'll see if that works." Still, I never imagined she would go as far as she did on the day itself, that she'd stand at the door of the venue, blocking my path, that she'd leave her seat empty like a statement carved in stone. Back then, I didn't know why she was doing it. I didn't know about the conversations she'd been having behind my back or the plans she'd been setting in motion. All I knew was that I'd spent my life under her shadow. And on the day I was supposed to step into the light, she'd found a new way to block the sun. It's a strange thing, how the worst wounds can be the ones that don't bleed. The small cuts, the ones that barely register in the moment, somehow leave the deepest scars. By the time my wedding day arrived, I'd been collecting them for months. The first came 2 weeks after Claire and I got engaged. We'd invited my parents over for dinner at our apartment, the same cramped place I'd been in since college, with mismatched chairs and a dining table I'd rescued from the curb. It wasn't much, but I'd cleaned every inch, cooked her favorite meal, set the table with the best I had. When they walked in, my father gave me a quick nod, a polite, "Smells good, son." My mother's eyes did a slow sweep of the room, pausing on the scratched table, the secondhand bookshelf, the slightly crooked frame over the couch. She didn't say anything. Not then. She waited until we were halfway through dessert, then looked at Claire and said, "You must be so excited to move somewhere more suitable." Claire laughed it off, answering lightly, "I love this place. It feels like home." But the damage was done. My mother smiled that smile she used when she thought she'd hidden the knife. After that, it was as if she'd made it her mission to find ways to remind me and Claire that she was the authority here. At a family lunch, she pulled out swatches of fabric she'd just happened to bring and laid them across the table. "These are the colors that photograph best," she said, as if the decision had already been made. When I reminded her that we'd already chosen our palette, she waved a hand. "Oh, I'm sure you'll change your mind once you see them in the venue." She started referring to the wedding as our event, not mine and Claire's, but ours as in hers. "We need to be sure the flowers don't clash with the drapes. We'll have to think about what people will say if we." Always we. One afternoon, Claire and I were meeting with the caterer when my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. "I've already booked someone else. Better reputation. We'll talk later." I didn't even know she had the number for the caterer we were meeting. When I called her, she answered with a breezy, "You'll thank me. Trust me, this is for the best." That phrase, "for the best," had followed me since childhood. It always meant the same thing. "I've decided, and your opinion is irrelevant." Claire was patient, more patient than I deserved. She'd put a hand on my arm when she saw me tense up, whisper, "Let it go, we'll fix it later." But even she had moments when I could see the frustration flicker in her eyes. It wasn't just the wedding details either. It was the little public moments she seemed to engineer. At a dinner with some of Claire's family, my mother launched into a story about how I'd nearly failed my first year of college. She left out the part where I'd been working 2 jobs to pay rent. When Claire's uncle asked about my career, my mother jumped in before I could answer. "He's still finding his way," she said, with that light laugh that made it sound like a joke. Everyone smiled politely. I felt the smile on my face crack at the edges. The closer we got to the wedding, the more frequent these moments became. A comment here, a decision made without me there, a story told in a way that made me the punchline. Individually, they were small enough to ignore. Together, they formed a pattern, a map of all the ways she could undermine me without ever raising her voice. And yet, I still thought she'd show up on the day, that she'd sit in that front row seat and at least pretend to be proud. I clung to that image like a lifeline, because the alternative, the idea that she might openly, deliberately humiliate me, was too big to fit into my head. The last of those small cuts came just 3 days before the wedding. We were at the rehearsal dinner in the restaurant's private room. The lights were low, the air warm with the smell of rosemary bread and wine. I stood to thank everyone for coming, to say how much it meant to have them there. My mother raised her glass, smiling up at me, and then she turned to Claire and said, "Let's just hope he keeps it together on the day. He's not exactly known for handling pressure." It was quiet enough that only our table heard it, loud enough that I saw my father's jaw tighten. My sister looked down, Claire's hand freeze halfway to her glass. I laughed it off in the moment. I had to. But that night, Lying awake beside Claire, I felt the sting of it settle deep. Somewhere inside, I think I knew. She wasn't going to change. Not in 3 days, not in 3 years. And maybe if I'd been honest with myself, I would have seen what was coming when I stood at that altar and looked at her empty chair. The morning of my wedding, I woke before the alarm. It was still dark outside, the kind of quiet that only comes before a day that's about to change everything. Claire was in another hotel room across the hall, following tradition. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, telling myself to breathe. It wasn't nerves about marrying her. That part was the only thing I was sure of. It was everything else, the day's logistics, the crowd, the fact that my family and hers would be in the same room, watching every move I made. And though I didn't want to admit it, my mother. By the time I reached the venue, a restored century-old building with tall arched windows and white stone steps, the sun had started to burn through the morning haze. The staff were moving chairs, arranging flowers, checking sound equipment. Inside, I could hear the faint notes of the string quartet warming up. I took it all in like I was looking at a photograph I'd seen in my mind 100 times. For a moment, I felt that rush I'd been waiting for. This is it. This is the day. I was adjusting my tie in the grand front hallway when I decided to step outside for a breath of air. The cold hit me instantly, a crisp breeze that carried the scent of fresh flowers from the florist unloading arrangements by the curb. I was about to turn back in when I heard her voice. "He doesn't come in here. Not today. Not ever." It took me a second to realize she was talking to the venue's head of security. Her back was to me, her posture sharp, hands clasped in front of her like she was dictating an agenda. The guard, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, looked caught between confusion and discomfort. "I'm sorry," he asked. "You heard me," she replied, her tone steady. "If he tries to walk through those doors, you stop him." My name followed. My name, clear and cold, like a verdict. I froze. My first thought was that I'd misunderstood. My second thought was, no, I hadn't. She meant it. This wasn't some joke or figure of speech. She was telling the guard to physically keep me out of my own wedding. The guard's eyes flicked over her shoulder and landed on me. We locked eyes for a split second. There was something in his expression I'll never forget, a mix of rips. Is this real? And what do you want me to do? I stepped forward before I could think better of it. The sound of my shoes on the stone steps made her turn. Her face didn't change, no surprise, no guilt. If anything, she seemed prepared. "Good morning," I said. My voice came out flatter than I intended. She tilted her head, offering the faintest smile. "We're just making sure everything goes smoothly." I glanced at the guard, then back at her. "By keeping me out," her smile didn't falter. "Don't be dramatic, I'm protecting the day." That phrase, protecting the day, lodged in my chest like a splinter. From what? From me? Before I could respond, I felt the eyes of passing guests on us, curious about the conversation happening at the entrance. I stepped past both of them without another word, my pulse pounding in my ears. Inside, the air felt warmer, but heavier. The ornate ceiling seemed to press down on me as I walked toward the preparation room. I could hear laughter from somewhere in the back, hers, mingling with a few relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about going to my father, but I knew he'd only tell me to keep the peace. I thought about telling Claire, but I didn't want to put that look on her face, the one she got when she was angry on my behalf. So I did nothing. I straightened my jacket, fixed my cufflinks, and told myself it didn't matter, that whatever had just happened at the door would fade into the background once the ceremony started. But the truth was, it was already bigger than the ceremony, because now it wasn't just months of subtle comments and quiet control. It was public, deliberate, and it told me something I hadn't let myself believe until that moment. She wasn't here for me at all. When the time came to walk into the ceremony space, I felt every step. I saw the guests rise, turning toward the aisle. I saw the flowers, the soft lighting, the expectant smiles, and in the front row, the seat I had pictured her in since the day we booked the venue, there was nothing but an empty chair. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel it beside me, like a void you can't ignore. And though the music swelled and my bride began her walk toward me, the echo of her words at the door followed me into that moment. Not today. Not ever. The ceremony began the way a fire starts, quietly, almost politely, with only a faint crackle of heat under the surface. I kept my eyes on Claire as she walked toward me, her arm linked with her father's. She looked beautiful, radiant in a way that almost made me forget the empty seat beside me. Almost. But no matter how much I focused on her, my peripheral vision kept drifting back to that chair. It sat there like a question no one wanted to answer. She reached me, her fingers finding mine. "You okay?" she whispered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear over the music. "Perfect," I lied. The officiant began speaking, his voice carrying across the room. Guests shifted in their seats, leaning in to catch every word. From where I stood, I could see my father's profile, stiff, unreadable, and my sister, eyes darting between me and my mother, who had taken a seat at the far edge of the second row, as far from me as she could be without leaving the room entirely. It didn't make sense. If she didn't want to be here, why show up at all? Why make a scene at the door only to come inside and pretend it never happened? The more I thought about it, the less it felt like a spur-of-the-moment decision, and the more it felt rehearsed. We said the vows, exchanged rings. I smiled at the right moments, laughed when Claire did, let my voice catch just enough to make it sound real when I promised, for better or worse. Inside, I was counting seconds. Every glance my mother made toward someone in the crowd, every time a relative leaned toward her and she tilted her head just slightly, listening, whispering back. By the time the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, I'd noticed it 3 times. Short exchanges, quick and quiet, but carrying the rhythm of coordination. Not idle chatter. Something else. The applause came, loud and warm, washing over us as we walked back down the aisle. For a moment, I let myself enjoy it. The feeling of Claire's hand in mine, the sound of our friends and family cheering. Then I caught sight of my mother, slipping out a side door before the crowd began to move. We were ushered into a side room while the staff began preparing the main hall for the reception. Claire kissed me, whispered something about finally being able to breathe, and was pulled away by her bridesmaids. I stayed behind, adjusting my tie in the mirror. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "Don't let it ruin the day." I turned to see him, Mark Jensen, an old family friend, my father's business partner from years ago, before the company was sold. He was dressed in a dark suit that fit better than any I'd ever seen him in, his silver hair combed back, his eyes sharp in a way that made me think he hadn't come here just to celebrate. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He glanced at the door, then stepped closer. "I don't have time to explain everything right now," he said, slipping something into my jacket pocket. A thin, sealed envelope. "Read it when you can, and whatever you do, don't mention it to your mother." "Mark, what?" He cut me off with a look. "She's not just here to make you uncomfortable. She's here to make sure you don't hear certain things, or see certain things." Before I could ask more, one of the event coordinators poked her head in, calling my name. Mark nodded once, clapped me on the shoulder, and left through a different door. I stood there for a moment, the envelope feeling heavier than paper should. Part of me wanted to rip it open immediately. Another part, the one that had learned the hard way what happens when you confront my mother without a plan, told me to wait. The reception hall was warm and buzzing when we entered. Glasses clinked, voices overlapped, waiters moved between tables with trays of champagne. I made my rounds with Claire, smiling for photos, shaking hands. But every time I glanced toward my mother, she was leaning towards someone, speaking low. And more than once, I caught the flicker of eyes turning toward me before sliding away. Half an hour in, I excused myself under the pretense of checking on something with the coordinator. I slipped into a quiet corner, away from the music and the laughter, and tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of a document I recognized immediately, the deed to a property. My father's signature was there. So was mine from years ago when he'd told me I was listed as a beneficiary. But there was another name added, my mother's, in handwriting that didn't match the official record, and a date from just 3 months earlier, a forged amendment. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. It wasn't just a piece of land. It was the last major asset my father had left behind. The one thing he'd made clear would be mine someday. Now it looked like my mother had other plans. The music from the reception bled faintly into the hallway, muffled by the thick walls. I folded the paper back into the envelope and slipped it into my pocket, the edges pressing against my ribs like a reminder. This is bigger than the empty chair. Bigger than the wedding. Back in the hall, I found her looking right at me, and for the first time that day, she smiled. Not the polite, public smile she'd been wearing all afternoon, but something sharper, like she knew I'd just opened the door to a room she'd been keeping locked for years. I kept my distance from her after that. It wasn't easy. She had a way of inserting herself into whatever corner of the room I was in, but I stayed close to Claire, let the photographers pull us into a dozen different poses, laughed at jokes I barely heard. The envelope in my pocket felt like a weight I couldn't shift. I kept thinking about the document, the way my father's signature looked against the grain of the paper, steady and certain, the way the new name, hers, was just slightly wrong, the ink darker, the strokes too careful. I'd seen enough of her adjustments over the years to recognize when she'd taken something that didn't belong to her. I was halfway through another round of congratulations with a table of Claire's relatives when the mood in the room shifted. It wasn't sudden, exactly, more like a ripple passing through the crowd. Conversations dipped, heads turned toward the entrance. I followed their gaze. He wasn't supposed to be here. Thomas Reed. The name flashed in my mind before I even registered his face. My father's former attorney, the one who had handled the finalization of the trust after the sale of the company. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark suit cut sharp enough to draw lines in the air. In one hand, a slim leather briefcase. In the other, a folded piece of paper. My mother saw him the same moment I did. Her expression froze just for a second. Then she turned, murmured something to the cousin beside her, and started moving toward the back of the room. Reed didn't let her get far. He crossed the floor with the easy stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. When he reached me, he didn't smile, didn't offer congratulations. He simply said, "We need to talk, now." I glanced at Claire. Her brow furrowed, but she gave a small nod. Reed led me out through a side door into the quieter hallway near the coat check. The hum of the reception dimmed behind us. He opened the briefcase, pulled out a folder, and handed it to me. Inside were more documents, copies of transfers, amendments, and letters. Some bore my father's handwriting, others had clearly been doctored. My mother's name appeared again and again, attached to assets I'd been told were secure. "This isn't the first time," Reed said, his voice low. "She's been moving things quietly for months. The property you found in that envelope? That's just one piece. She's preparing to shift everything into her name before the end of the fiscal year." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because she doesn't think you can stop her," he said plainly, "and because she made the mistake of crossing someone she shouldn't have." Before I could ask what he meant, the door behind us swung open. Mark Jensen stepped in, the same Mark who had slipped me the envelope earlier. His expression was tight, but there was a glint in his eye, the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing a long game is about to pay off. "Tom," Mark said, nodding to Reed. "You filled him in?" Mark turned to me. "She's going to try something tonight. Before the reception ends. You'll probably see it coming now. The real question is whether you're ready to respond in front of everyone." "In front of everyone?" I repeated. "That's the only way to make it stick," Reed said. "If you challenge her privately, she'll deny it. She'll twist it until you look like the one causing trouble. But if the truth comes out here with witnesses..." He let the thought hang in the air. My pulse thudded in my ears. The idea of a confrontation, here, now, on my wedding day, was almost unthinkable. But the alternative was worse. I'd seen what she could do in the shadows. I wasn't going to give her more time there. Before I could answer, Claire appeared in the doorway. She looked from me to Mark to Reed, then at the open folder in my hands. "What's going on?" she asked. I hesitated, weighing the urge to protect her from this against the knowledge that it was already part of our day whether I wanted it to be or not. "She's been taking things," I said finally. "From the trust, from me." Claire's eyes hardened in a way I'd only seen once before, the day she'd walked away from a job that had been bleeding her dry. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Then let's make sure she can't take anything else. Mark's mouth twitched into the faintest smile. You chose well. We worked quickly. Reed laid out the key documents, showing me where the signatures had been altered, where the timelines didn't match. Mark explained how she'd been setting up the transfers to look legitimate. Claire asked the questions I hadn't thought to, the kind that forced them to consider how this would play in front of a crowd. By the time we stepped back into the reception, the plan was set. It wouldn't take much, just the right moment, the right words, and one piece of undeniable proof. The rest would unravel itself. The band had started up again, a slow jazz number curling through the air. Guests were back to eating, drinking, laughing. My mother was at a table near the center, her posture perfect, her smile warm as she spoke to a small group of relatives. Mark caught my eye from across the room and gave the smallest nod. Reed moved to the edge of the floor, positioning himself so he could see both her and me. Claire squeezed my hand once, hard, and let go. The moment was coming. I could feel it, the way you can feel a storm before it breaks. The pressure in the air, the shift in the light. And I knew, without question, that whatever happened next was going to change the room. Maybe the whole family. Maybe everything. I've been in rooms where every smile was fake, where every handshake carried a hidden blade. But I had never stood in one where I knew, with absolute certainty, that a storm was about to rip the ceiling off. The jazz number faded into polite applause, glasses clinked, waiters wove between the tables with trays of champagne. I could see my mother clearly now, seated at a round table in the middle of the room. She had her back perfectly straight, her hair in the same intricate twist she'd worn at every formal family event for the last decade. A group of aunts and cousins leaned in around her, laughing at something she'd just said. Mark had told me to wait for her to move first. She'll give you an opening, he'd said. She can't help herself. I didn't have to wait long. As the band began their next song, she rose from her seat and started toward the microphone stand near the dance floor. A few heads turned. She was not on the schedule to speak, but she moved with the confidence of someone who believed she didn't need permission. Just a few words, she said, taking the mic from the band's vocalist with a smile. I think it's only right that I, as the mother of the groom, say something on such a special day. The room quieted. A few guests leaned forward, expecting a heartfelt toast. I already knew better. She looked directly at me, her smile warm enough that anyone who didn't know her might think it was genuine. First, I want to say how beautiful Claire looks tonight. She's truly elevated our family. A ripple of polite laughter. I felt Claire's hand tense on mine under the table. And as for my son, her voice softened, but there was an edge there, the same one I'd heard my entire life. Well, we've had our differences, but I'm hopeful. She let the word hang in the air like a fragile ornament, that marriage will give him the structure he's been lacking. It was subtle, but it landed. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me, then back to her. She had set the hook. She might have left it at that, but she didn't. And I'm especially glad, she continued, that certain misunderstandings about our family's affairs won't distract us from celebrating tonight. That was it. The opening. Mark's voice in my head. You'll know when she tries to paint the narrative. That's when you take it back. I stood. The scrape of my chair against the floor cut through the polite hum of the crowd. Claire rose beside me. Actually, I said, my voice carrying more steadily than I felt, I think now is the perfect time to clear up those misunderstandings. Her eyes locked on mine, and for the first time all day, her smile faltered. I walked to the edge of the dance floor, motioning for the microphone. The vocalist hesitated, then handed it to me. I could feel every eye in the room on us now. I wasn't going to say anything tonight, I began, because I didn't want to take away from what this day is supposed to be. But since my mother brought it up, I think it's only fair to be transparent. From the corner of my vision, I saw Reed step into the open, the folder in his hands. He stopped just behind me, close enough that I could take the papers when I was ready. My father left behind a trust, I said, scanning the room. A trust that was meant to ensure the stability of the family, to protect what he built. In that trust were assets that were very clearly assigned. I let my gaze rest on her again. Recently, some of those assets have been moved, without my knowledge, without legal authority. A murmur ran through the guests. My mother straightened her shoulders, but she didn't speak. Not yet. I turned to Reed, who handed me the first page from the folder, the deed I'd found in the envelope earlier. I held it up so the front tables could see. This property, I continued, was one of them. My father signed it over with the intent that it would remain in my name. But 3 months ago, a new amendment appeared, adding another name, a signature that doesn't match the original, a forgery. The murmur swelled. At a table near the back, one of my uncles exchanged a sharp look with his wife. Cameras came out, phones being raised, flashes of light. My mother finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying. "This is not the time or the place for—" "This is exactly the time and place," I said, cutting her off. "Because the only way to stop a lie is to tell the truth where everyone can hear it." She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "You don't understand the complexities of—" "I understand enough," I said, my tone sharpening. "I understand that while we were planning this wedding, while I was thinking about a future with my wife, you were making sure that the future my father intended for me would never happen." The room was silent, except for the faint hiss of the microphone. Her composure cracked then, just a hairline fracture, but enough for me to see it. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers flexed around the edge of her clutch. "This isn't over," she said quietly, but the mic caught it, and the words rolled out across the room. I lowered the microphone, my pulse roaring in my ears. "No," I said. "It's just beginning." For a long, thin moment after I said it, she just stood there. One hand on her clutch, the other hanging loosely at her side, her eyes fixed on me as if she could stare the words back into my throat. Then her lips curved. Not into a smile exactly, but into that tight, practiced expression she wore when she was about to play her next move. "You know," she said, her voice warm enough to almost sound amused, "I'm actually relieved this is coming out now. It gives me the chance to explain before things get blown out of proportion." It was a clever pivot. She shifted her posture so she was angled toward the guests, not me, as though she and I were on the same side and she was speaking on our behalf. "That property?" she continued, gesturing toward the document in my hand. "Yes, my name is on it, because when your father passed, there were concerns about your readiness to manage certain responsibilities." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. She leaned in just slightly, letting her tone drop to that confidential register she'd mastered years ago. "Anyone who knows my son knows he's impulsive. I've spent years protecting him from decisions that could hurt him in the long run. It was the same old weapon, just polished for the occasion. Question my competence, dress it in maternal concern, and let people draw their own conclusions." I felt my jaw tighten, but before I could speak, she went in for the second strike. "And let's be honest," she said, looking directly at me now, "your recent choices haven't exactly inspired confidence. The career changes, the disagreements with the family business. You've always been a bit," she paused, pretending to search for a kinder word, "untethered. I wasn't about to let your father's legacy be put at risk because you wanted to prove a point." There it was, the narrative she wanted. Not theft, not forgery, protection, responsibility, a mother cleaning up after her reckless son. A few heads nodded around the room, relatives who had always taken her side, or guests who didn't know the full history. Others sat stiff, uncertain, eyes flicking between us. I could feel the balance of the room tilting, the momentum she was trying to reclaim. She thrived in these moments, in the soft sway of opinion, in the way people wanted to believe the person speaking calmly into the microphone. But she wasn't finished. "And as for these accusations," she said, turning her gaze toward Reed, who stood silently at the edge of the dance floor, "I think it's worth noting that certain people here may have motives of their own, old grievances, unfinished business with our family. Isn't that right, Thomas?" She was trying to pull him into the mud, to make it look like this was a setup orchestrated by her enemies rather than a son standing up for himself. Reed didn't flinch. "I'm here because I was asked to protect the integrity of a trust," he said evenly, "and because forgery is a crime." The word crime hung in the air like a dropped glass. Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't lose her composure. "Big words," she replied, "but let's remember, documents can be doctored in more than one direction. And I have no doubt that when the full story comes out, it will be clear I was acting in the best interest of my son, his wife, and this family." It was a masterclass in reframing, turn defense into offense, imply that your accuser is just as dirty, wrap it all in the language of sacrifice. I could feel the split in the room widening. My father's brother, seated near the front, leaned back in his chair with a skeptical frown. My cousin whispered something to her husband, eyes narrowed in my direction. At the same time, I saw Claire's maid of honor shake her head in disgust, and one of my old friends from school mutter under his breath, "Unbelievable." She thought she'd regained the ground she'd lost. I could see it in the way her chin lifted slightly, the way her gaze swept the room to gauge her audience. But she'd made a mistake. Two, actually. The first was bringing Reed into this publicly. She had just legitimized him as part of the conversation, which meant his word now carried as much weight in this room as hers. The second was assuming I didn't have anything else. I stepped forward, microphone still in my hand. "You talk about protecting me," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs, "but protection doesn't require forging signatures. It doesn't require hiding documents, and it definitely doesn't require lying to my face." Her mouth opened, probably to deliver another calm, reasonable deflection, but I didn't give her the chance. "You've been moving assets out of my reach for months. Property, investments, accounts I didn't even know existed. And you didn't do it to protect me. You did it to make sure I'd never be able to stand on my own." I turned slightly, signaling to Reed. He stepped forward and handed me a second document. "This," I said, holding it up so the nearest tables could see, "isn't about one property. It's about a pattern, transfers into shell accounts, signatures that don't match, dates that line up just a little too perfectly with each family trip you took without telling anyone where you were going." The volume in the room rose again, not in applause but in the low electric murmur of people processing something they weren't supposed to hear. She shook her head, smiling that tight smile again. "You've misunderstood." "No," I said, and my voice was sharper than I'd meant it to be. "I finally understand exactly what you've been doing." For the first time that night, her eyes flickered. It was quick, a small, involuntary movement, but I saw it. So did a few others. I let the silence stretch for just long enough, then added, "And before this night is over, everyone else here will understand too." She didn't shout. My mother never shouted. She didn't need to. But when she moved, it was like watching a chess master pick up a piece they'd been holding back for the entire game. She stepped away from me, heels clicking on the polished floor, and made her way to the far side of the room where a man in a gray suit had been standing quietly since the start of the reception. I hadn't noticed him before. His presence was so neutral, it was almost invisible. Until now. The crowd's hum shifted into a low, curious murmur as she brought him forward. "This," she announced, "is Mr. Dalton, my legal counsel." That got attention. The words legal counsel at a wedding reception will do that. Dalton was mid-40s, clean-shaven, the kind of man whose tie knot was perfectly symmetrical and whose gaze didn't wander. He carried a black portfolio under one arm and an expression that gave away nothing. "I wasn't planning on involving him tonight," my mother said, voice pitched just right to sound like she was being forced into this. "But since you've chosen to air private family matters in front of all our friends and relatives, I think it's only fair that we address them properly." She took the microphone from me, not yanking, just claiming it as if it belonged to her all along, and handed it to Dalton. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dalton began, "my client has been accused of some very serious misconduct this evening. I'd like to state unequivocally that these accusations are baseless. In fact," he opened the portfolio and pulled out a set of neatly clipped papers. "We have evidence here that calls into question the credibility of the claims made against her." A ripple went through the guests again. Phones tilted upward, recording now. I caught Claire's eyes across the room, steady, unflinching, and I could almost hear her thinking the same thing I was. "Here it comes." Dalton held up a page. This is a notarized statement indicating that the property in question was transferred with the knowledge and consent of all parties involved, including the groom. Furthermore, he reached for a second page. We have documentation showing that the amendments to the trust were filed in accordance with state law. It was a clean, calculated counterstrike, not an emotional plea, a paper shield. That's a forgery, Reed said flatly from the edge of the crowd. Dalton didn't flinch. Then you won't mind if we let the proper authorities decide that. It was a trap. If I reacted too aggressively, she'd paint me as unstable. If I stayed silent, the narrative would shift toward her, calm, in control, backed by a professional voice. She looked at me then, that glint in her eyes sharp as cut glass. This could have been handled privately, she said, the words just loud enough for the mic to catch. But you wanted a scene, and now you have one. For a beat, I considered walking away, letting it end here. But something in me, maybe years of small humiliations, maybe the sight of her turning my own wedding into her stage, snapped. Show them the rest, I said. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Show them page 3 in that portfolio, I repeated, my voice steady. He hesitated, just for a second, then flipped to the page. He glanced at it, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. That's the part where, I continued, in your own words, you advised her to move assets into a shell account to protect them from contested claims. I took a step forward, my voice carrying now. You didn't expect that to be on a recorded line, did you? A ripple of shock moved through the room. Dalton closed the portfolio, but the damage was already done. The pause had been too long, the look on his face too telling. My mother stepped forward, but I held up a hand. Don't, I said, the word sharper than I'd planned. Don't stand here and pretend this is about protection or family or love. You've been planning this for months, and you thought you'd get away with it because no one would challenge you in public. Her composure cracked then, the faintest tremor in her voice. You have no idea what you're talking about. I took the microphone back, my grip firm. I know exactly what I'm talking about, and now so does everyone else. The room was a split landscape. Half the faces watching her, half watching me, all of them caught in that silent, heavy moment where the truth has stepped into the open and no one knows what will happen next. It was Dalton who broke it. I think, he said, his voice cooler now, this is a conversation best had elsewhere. But it was too late for elsewhere. The conversation was here, and it wasn't going back into the shadows. The silence after Dalton's last words wasn't the quiet of confusion. It was the kind that follows a verdict. People had already made up their minds, even if they didn't say it out loud. And I could see it, plain as the bouquet on Claire's table. The balance had tipped. It's hard to explain how quickly a room can turn. 1 minute it's neutral ground, polite, contained, measured. The next, the current changes, and it's all leaning in one direction. In that moment, it was leaning toward me. Claire stepped forward before I could say anything else. She didn't take the microphone. She didn't need to. Her voice carried on its own. I think we've heard enough for tonight, she said, looking directly at my mother. This is our wedding, and while I can't control what anyone else chooses to bring into it, I can control what we focus on from this point forward. It was firm, but not hostile, the kind of tone that draws people to your side without them even realizing it. And it landed. A few guests nodded. Someone near the back even clapped, then quickly stopped, embarrassed by the sound in the heavy air. My mother's jaw was tight, her hands gripping the edge of her clutch like it might hold her steady. She glanced at Dalton, but he was already looking toward the exit, clearly calculating how quickly he could get her out of there without making it look like a retreat. I didn't give her the chance. This isn't about embarrassing you, I said, my voice steady but loud enough to fill the room. It's about ending something that should have ended a long time ago. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life wondering what's been taken from me behind closed doors. Not anymore. The words weren't just for her. They were for me. For every quiet moment over the years when I'd swallowed an insult, let a decision be made over my head, told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I handed the microphone back to the vocalist, signaling that the speeches were over. Then I turned to Claire, took her hand, and led her toward the dance floor. The band, to their credit, picked up the cue without missing a beat. The first notes of our song floated into the air, soft and low. We moved together, the rest of the room blurring at the edges. I could still feel eyes on us, still hear the low murmur of whispered commentary, but it no longer felt like judgment. It felt like witnessing. Halfway through the dance, I saw my mother heading toward the door, Dalton a step behind her. She didn't look back. Not once. That used to be the thing I feared most, her walking away from me, her approval gone with her. Now, it just felt like space opening up. When the song ended, the guests applauded, and I felt the shift again, subtle but unmistakable. People began to relax, conversations picked up, laughter returned in cautious bursts. The reception wasn't back to normal, not yet, but it was moving, and it was moving in the direction I wanted. Mark appeared at my side as we left the dance floor. "That was cleaner than I expected," he said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "You handled it." "Not alone," I replied, glancing at Claire. Reed joined us a moment later. "I'll hold on to the documents for now," he said. "We'll take the legal steps this week. But the most important thing? You've just made it a lot harder for her to move in the shadows. Half this room will be watching now." That was the truth of it. Whatever happened next, in courtrooms, in negotiations, in whatever private battles still lay ahead, the secrecy was gone. And for someone like her, that was as damaging as any verdict. The rest of the evening unfolded in a strange rhythm, part celebration, part reckoning. Some guests came to us with warm congratulations, pretending they hadn't just watched a family war break out in real time. Others offered quiet words of support, their eyes saying more than their mouths ever could. A few avoided me entirely. That was fine. By the time the last song played, and Claire and I walked out under a shower of sparklers, the cold night air felt cleaner than it had in years. In the car, as the driver pulled away, I glanced back once at the venue. Through the tall windows, I could still see clusters of people talking, their silhouettes animated, heads shaking, hands gesturing. They would carry this story out into the world now, each in their own way, but all with the same truth at its core. Claire squeezed my hand. "You all right?" I thought about it for a moment. About the empty chair, about the envelope in my pocket, about the fact that, for the first time in years, I hadn't let her dictate the story. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think I am." The morning after the wedding, I woke to sunlight spilling through the hotel curtains and the sound of Claire moving quietly around the room. She was still in her robe, hair loosely tied back, scrolling through her phone with that little crease in her brow she got when she was reading something carefully. "They've already started," she said without looking up. "Who?" I asked, still half asleep. "Your family," she replied, handing me the phone. It was opened to a group message I'd been added to years ago and muted almost immediately. The feed was alive, not with congratulations or well wishes, but with speculation. Aunts and cousins trading versions of what they thought they'd seen the night before, some defending my mother, others not saying much at all. And then, farther down, a single terse message from my father, "We'll talk soon." I set the phone down. "I guess the honeymoon starts with more family politics." Claire smiled faintly. "Or," she said, "we start with breakfast and let them wait." We chose breakfast. By the time we returned from a few days away, just the two of us, no phones, no news, the dust had started to settle. In some corners, that meant silence. In others, it meant the opposite. Reed had already begun the formal legal process to secure the trust, freezing any transfers until the matter could be resolved in court. The documents he'd presented and my mother's reactions had given us more than enough leverage. The first real shift came from my father. He called one evening, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't know," he said. "Not all of it. Maybe I should have, but—" He trailed off, the weight of years of looking the other way pressing into the pause. "I'm sorry." It wasn't absolution, but it was something. Claire and I began building routines that had nothing to do with my mother's approval or interference. I threw myself into work, not out of desperation this time, but because I wanted to. Decisions felt lighter when I knew no one was going to undermine them from behind a closed door. The strangest part was how quickly some people moved on. The same relatives who had watched the confrontation with wide eyes at the wedding now sent casual texts as if nothing had happened. Others kept their distance entirely. I suspected my mother's version of the story was already making the rounds in their circles. But every so often, I'd get a quiet message from someone who'd been there. A short note, "Good for you," or "She's been doing that for years." It was enough to remind me that truth has a way of finding its own witnesses. My mother never called, not once. Dalton sent a formal notice disputing our claims, but it was so carefully worded it almost read like an admission that they knew the tide had turned. Reed said it would be months before the legal matter was fully resolved, but he was confident. "She's lost the shadows," he said. "That's where she operated best. Now every move she makes is under a light." That was the real victory. Not the paperwork or the frozen accounts, but the knowledge that she could no longer work unseen. One evening, a couple of weeks after we'd settled back into normal life, I walked past the small desk in our apartment where I dropped the envelope Mark had given me. I picked it up, opened it again, and studied the deed inside. It no longer felt like a threat. It felt like evidence of a turning point, the moment I stopped letting her dictate the terms of my life. Claire came up behind me, resting her chin on my shoulder. "Thinking about it?" "Thinking about what's next," I said. Because for the first time, what's next didn't mean waiting for her to make the first move. It meant deciding for myself. It was a Saturday morning, 3 months after the wedding, when the letter arrived. Not an email, not a phone call, a real, tangible letter, the kind you can feel in your hands. Heavy paper, expensive envelope, my name written in my mother's precise script. For a moment, I considered not opening it. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. Nothing that would make me forget the sound of her voice at the venue door telling someone to keep me out. But curiosity, or maybe closure, won out. Inside was a single page. No greeting, no signature. Just 2 lines. "You think you've won, but you don't understand what you've lost." I stared at it for a long time, waiting for the sting. It didn't come. Instead, I felt lighter. Because for the first time, I saw her words for what they were. Not prophecy, not truth, just the last grasp of someone who couldn't control the ending. I folded the letter once, set it on the table, and left it there. Life had moved on. The legal process was still unfolding, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The properties and accounts were protected, the trust secured. More importantly, the space she used to occupy in my mind was smaller now, shrinking every day. My father called more often, sometimes just to talk about the weather or a baseball game. A few relatives who'd kept their distance had started inviting us over, as if testing the waters. And Claire and I, we'd built a life that was ours, one decision at a time. One evening, we took a walk through a quiet neighborhood we'd been thinking about moving to. The sun was setting, the air cool, and for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about defense or strategy. I was thinking about what we could build. On the way back, Claire stopped at a small park and sat on a bench. She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You know, she doesn't get to be the center of your story anymore." I smiled. "No, she doesn't." We sat there in comfortable silence, the kind you only get when the person beside you knows exactly where you've been and where you're going. Later that night, back at the apartment, I found myself standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. The same view I'd seen countless times before, but it felt different now. It wasn't a backdrop to someone else's decisions. It was a horizon I could walk toward on my own terms. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn her approval, the way I'd bent myself into shapes that didn't fit just to avoid her disapproval. And I thought about how it all came to a head. In public, on the day she thought she could humiliate me into silence, and how that moment had given me something I hadn't had in years, the freedom to choose what mattered. If you're listening to this, maybe you've got someone in your life who treats you like your value is theirs to decide. Here's what I learned. The hardest thing isn't standing up to them. It's realizing you never needed their permission to stand at all. And when you finally see that, that's when you get to close the door. Not to keep them out, but to keep yourself in. Safe, whole, free.